Hello and welcome to Clumsy Crafting. I am your host, Bray. Now today's video will be about embroidery and cross-stitching techniques. And unfortunately, this will be the last video of the semester. I just have too much on my plate. I can't handle doing all of it at the same time. And I really enjoyed doing this video series, but unfortunately this will be our last video. So my reason for doing embroidery and cross-stitch at the end is because it's very similar to hand sewing, which we just did, but it's obviously more decorative and it does use some different materials. It uses special needles, special thread, even special fabric. So I've got my embroidery materials here, and this is just a plain cotton fabric that won't stretch too much. I have put the fabric in an embroidery hoop to hold it straight and steady. I have also given myself a couple of little guidelines on the fabric. You can see I've drawn some lines in pencil and a little shape. In addition to my fabric, I have 3 strands of embroidery thread into an embroidery needle. Now, embroidery needles are, oh boy, I don't know where the camera is, do I? So embroidery needles are very similar to sewing needles. They have a sharp point, but they have a much bigger eye at the back, which allows you to fit in more threads, which is what you want, because for embroidery, you're normally using 2 to 3 threads, whereas with sewing, you're usually only using the 1. And this is just simply a dark grayish blue color embroidery threads, 3 strands from DCM, and I've put a single knot at the end. You don't always have to knot embroidery thread at the end, but I came from hand sewing to embroidery, and it's just easier for me to do it in that way, so keep that in mind. Now that we've established our materials, we can get into the stitches. Now this is a back stitch. It's the most simple embroidery stitch, and you've already done it before, so it should be relatively easy to understand and figure out. You come in through the back of the fabric, then go back in through the front, just a little ways away from where you first came up. And then you're going to come up again and go back to where you went in the second time. And this will create a line of stitches. Now, backstitch in embroidery is normally used for lines. This could be straight lines, curved lines. You're generally going to want to keep your stitches about the same length, so don't make them too long or too short. But here are some things to keep in mind. If you're doing a straight line, shorter stitches will be easier. But if you're doing curved, then you need the longer stitches in order to make that curve nice and soft. You will also notice that sometimes in this video I kind of go in a few times before pulling up my fabric, and that's because, especially if you're working with fabric that doesn't have clear guides, generally you want to test out where you're going to go before you make the final commitment to it, because last thing you want is to go up and then go in and then realize, oh no, I was supposed to be 2 pieces over to the side. Now I've kept this mostly straight so far, but I am going to curve it a little bit just to show you how it does curve. One thing I will state is that try to keep the tension of your stitches pretty even. If you make it too tight, then you risk wrinkling the fabric, and we don't want that. We want it to be nice and straight and flat. Now we're just going to speed up for a few seconds as I finish the row. So there you go. That is how you do a simple embroidery backstitch. And this is pretty common for solid lines in embroidery because it does create a more or less solid line, and it can be curved and bent, whereas just making one big stitch wouldn't be able to do that. Now, once you're done with an embroidery project, generally what you're going to do is you're going to flip it over, run your working thread underneath some of your stitches, and tie it off. You can knot it, or you can just run it under and cut it. I tend to knot it, but that also depends on how much you actually have done on the back. If I have a lot of stitches, I'll generally just run it through and then cut it. This one I'm knotting off. The next stitch I'm going to teach you is arguably the second most common stitch in embroidery, and this is called a satin stitch. And that's actually what I do this little diamond for. A satin stitch is how you fill in big blocks of color. Generally, you go in at the corner or the edge of a shape, and then you simply make one big stitch over to the other edge. Now, if you were doing a curved shape like a circle, you just go from one side to the other. And basically what you're going to do is you're just going to make straight lines across the piece. So you're going to go in next to where you first inserted. So on that same line that you started on, and then end on the same line you went in through. And that's how you do a satin stitch. And basically it's just a way of filling in a shape. It's sort of like coloring, but with thread. Now, something to keep in mind, and again, this is why you're going to want a sturdy fabric that won't stretch and bend too much, is that the tighter you pull your satin stitches, the more your fabric will bend. As you can see, mine is bending a little bit. But again, you're just going to keep going in through the one side and then go out through the other. Now, there are a few things you do want to keep in mind when you're doing a satin stitch, and that is that, one, you generally want a very clear shape so that your edges are straight and clean. If they're not straight and clean, there are ways of covering it up. You can go back over, you can do it around with a back stitch that'll cover it. But generally, you're going to want a very clear shape so that you know exactly where you're going in and out. Second of all, there's some of you who are watching this who are probably thinking, well, this is a waste of thread. Why don't you just go back in through the fabric right near where you went under? And there is actually a reason for doing it, and that is because if you do that, you risk pulling out the fabric. You risk breaking the fibers that hold that little section of fabric together. And it becomes very obvious when you do that because there's always a little bit of a gap that you don't get with a traditional satin stitch. So I know it wastes a lot of thread covering both the back and the front, but trust me, just do it this way. It's the way that's been tried and tested and we know works. Now I could spend the whole day filling in this shape, but we've got other embroidery stitches to look at, so we're just gonna stop here about halfway full. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is how you do a satin stitch. And again, you're just gonna go underneath and knot off your thread. Now we're gonna move on to French knots. So generally you're gonna go in and then you're going to wrap your thread around your needle and go in very close to your first entry. And you're going to hold the thread tight and pull the needle through. Now, I wouldn't say you're going to use French knots a ton, but you do use them pretty often in my experience. So it's a good thing to know how to do them. Plus, they can be a little bit finicky, so the sooner you learn a good technique, the better. And I'm just going to show you it a few more times. And basically, you're going to wrap it once or twice. Usually you're not going to go above that because the more you do it, the clunkier the knot gets. But you could do it 3 or 4 times if you really wanted to. But those are how you do French knots. You just go in, you wrap it around a few times, and then you pull it through. And it just creates a nice little knot to be used in your embroidery. Sometimes you can use it as a period for a sentence. Sometimes you can use it in a flower to make it look like a puffball. It's really up to you. And I'm just pulling through a final time, and that's our last French knot. And again, you're just gonna tie off and cut your thread. Now, I don't think this next thing I'm gonna teach you is all that common. I've never really needed to use it, but people have, so I guess it's more common in other types of embroidery. But it's basically called a woven wheel or a wagon wheel. Generally what you're gonna do is you're going to make 5 little lines coming out from a central point, so like spokes on a wheel. And then what you're going to do is you're going to weave your thread through and under these spokes. Now this can be a little bit of a finicky stitch because you need to make sure all of your spokes are the same length, otherwise you'll have some weird things going on. And also it can be a little bit hard to do the weaving. But people seem to like doing it. It creates a nice little flower shape, so go nuts, I guess. But you're just going to do what I do. You're going to make these little spokes all going into the central point, or all coming out of a central point. Up to you, really. But generally, you're going to want 5. If you decide to do more, just make sure that it's an odd number because you want to make sure that the weaving changes every single time you go around. And then once you've pulled the final one through, mine are very uneven, you're just going to insert your thread again close to where you came up. And then you're just going to weave in through the spokes. Now I'm not going to do this entire thing because that would be really big and take a long time, but I will show you it to a certain point as well as how I weave and stuff. And I'll speed it up a bit because this will take a while. Now, I've pretty much reached the end of my thread, so I'm going to end this wagon wheel here, but normally you'd follow it out to the end of the spokes, and by the end you'd have a very nice, very fluffy, very full-looking rose type shape, which could be very useful for flowers, which are a common motif in embroidery. Now we're going to get into cross stitch. Now you'll notice I have some slightly different materials. I have this black Aida fabric, I have some light colored embroidery floss to contrast against the fabric, and I have a cross stitch needle, which is a lot thicker but a lot duller than an embroidery needle because, as you might notice, Aida fabric already has holes in it, which is what you use for cross stitch. You don't need a sharp point because the fabric is designed to have a needle go through it without one. So I'm just going to cut myself some embroidery floss here. Generally, I go from the tip of my fingers to the end of my elbows. And you're going to pull apart the 6 strands. I normally use about 2 strands for embroidery and cross stitch. Sometimes I use 3 if I need it to be a bit thicker. Problem is, anything above 2 is really hard to get through that eye hole of the sewing needle. So just keep that in mind when deciding how many threads to use. Now, once you've got your thread in through the eye hole, you're generally going to tie a knot at the end. You don't always have to do this. Sometimes you can start sewing and sew over your thread to hold it in place. But having a knot just gives you that extra security. So it might be something to do when you're just starting out. Now the most commonly used stitch in cross stitch is a full cross stitch. And that's where you go into the back of the fabric. Then you're going to go in again through the whole diagonal from your starting point. Now you're going to go into one of the entry points right next to your previous 2 holes. and cross over your little diagonal piece in order to make an X. At least that's what I would have done if I hadn't had this small issue on the back. And you will sometimes have this in cross stitch or embroidery where you go to make a stitch and you accidentally trap your own thread. It's annoying, but it's not a huge hassle. You're generally just going to pull up the thread, pull the rest of the floss through, and then pull it taut. And so now I'm going to finish making that X. And once you have a full cross stitch, you'll have just like a little X in the fabric. Now we're going to get into the next most common cross stitch, which is a half cross stitch. So you're going to do the first step of a cross stitch, and you're just going to make a diagonal. You're not going to cross it over again. You're just going to make one diagonal. And these are normally used for corners or rounded edges because it does have that diagonal shape to it. The next stitch I'm going to teach you is a quarter cross stitch, and this is a little hard because instead of going through one of the pre-made entry points, you're going to punch through the mesh of the fabric, which is really hard because cross stitch needles aren't made to punch through fabric. They're made to go through pre-made entry points. So as you can see, I do struggle a little bit with it. For instance, as my thread gets knotted up and I get a little frustrated. And it does take me a moment to unknot it. And there we go. There is our quarter cross stitch. It's much smaller than the previous two stitches. It's a little bit less even because, again, you're punching through that fabric. You're not using the pre-made entry points that the rest of the fabric has. And it's really not the best thing, but you might have to do it on occasion. So the next thing I'm going to teach you is not so much a separate stitch as it is a technique. It is how you do cross stitches in a line. So generally what you're going to do is you're just going to make a line of half cross stitches. So you're going to go in through an entry point and then go out diagonally. And then you're going to go under that entry point and go out diagonally. And you're going to do that over and over again until you have a line. And then you're going to go back and do a bunch of half crochets in the other direction, so it makes a small series of X's. And this is actually one of the interesting things about cross stitch as compared to embroidery, is embroidery has a bunch of specific stitches for different things, whereas cross stitch has 2 to 3 standard stitches that just sort of get used in a variety of shapes and ways. So it's a little bit easier to start out with as a craft. And those are the things you'll want to consider when deciding what craft to make, similar with knitting and crocheting. So that's how you make a row of cross stitches. Now generally these ones are going to be the most common ones you're using. A full cross stitch, a half cross stitch. You probably won't use quarter too much, but the row will be pretty common because you're making shapes and lines. Now I'm going to teach you 2 techniques you technically already know, but I'm going to teach you them for cross stitch. And that is a back stitch and a French knot. And they're a little bit different because of the fabric, so I'm going to show them to you. Now for a back stitch, you're going to do the exact same technique you've done for all of our fabrics, only this time you're going to use the pre-made entry points. And this is really good for 2 reasons. One, pretty much all of your stitches will be the exact same length because the pre-made entry points are all a standard length away from each other. 2, you can be absolutely sure that your back stitches are going to be straight, because if they're not straight, that's not a back stitch, that's a half cross stitch. So again, you're just going to keep doing this thing you've been doing, and that is how you do a back stitch on Ida fabric. Now I'm going to teach you how to do a French knot in Ida fabric, which is very hard because, again, like the quarter stitch, you have to punch a hole through the fabric. So generally what I would recommend is sort of pre-punch your hole. Take your needle and just sort of jab it where you want the knot to go, because that will make it so much easier to actually make the knot. Once you have a hole punched in, just wrap your floss around your needle and pull it tight as you pull the needle through your pre-punched hole. And that will create a tiny little French knot. Now it won't look as nice as your embroidery French knots because of the fabric, but it will be a French knot, and that's the whole point. So today you learned how to do a full cross stitch, a half, a quarter a line of cross stitches, a back stitch, and a French knot. In embroidery, you learned how to do a series of back stitches, you learned how to do French knots, you learned how to do a satin stitch, and you kind of learned how to do a wagon wheel stitch. Now, I had a lovely time crafting with you today, and I also had a lovely time crafting with you over the course of these past 7 weeks, and I'm sorry it had to come to an end early, but that's just how life worked out. And I hope you had a wonderful time crafting with me this whole series. This was a great experience for me, and I hope it was a great experience for you. This is Clumsy Crafting. I am your host, Bray Wright, and I hope you have a wonderful day. Bye.